Hey, this is Sean, and welcome back to Colored Bean Academy. Tonight we're going to talk about the first and maybe even the most important decision you'll make when creating or recreating a design, and that's how to choose what program to build it in. Now, as a graphic designer, we typically float back and forth between Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign. In general, Photoshop and Illustrator are for creating graphics, where InDesign is for laying them out and flowing text around them. Now, in practical terms, you can do page layout in Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign, and there are pros and cons to each one. InDesign, on the other hand, is almost purely for layout. You can technically do some vector artwork in InDesign, but Illustrator is by far the better tool. What we're going to do is look at 3 designs and talk about what I would choose to build them in and why. So let's get started. These are 3 contests from the recent past. The Rotary Club Bicycle Design was the Oklahoma District Mechanical Contest in 2019. The Bitstorm Games Dragon Design was the Oklahoma State Mechanical that we designed last year, and the Colorado Health Design was the Colorado State Mechanical in 2016. The original artwork for these 3 pieces was designed respectively in Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign. And while we know for a fact that those programs were used, it also happens to be exactly what I would have guessed by looking at them, and what I would have chosen if I were creating them by myself. So let's talk about the why. This first design is a bit of a toss-up. There's not a huge reason to build it in one program over another, but since there are 0 vector elements, I'd probably remove Illustrator from consideration unless you're just crazy fast in Illustrator. So why do I think Photoshop? The big ones for me are the glows and shadows, which are a bit quicker and easier in Photoshop, the lack of an obvious column structure, and the fact that there are really no consistent styles to the type that would imply the use of paragraph styles, which Photoshop doesn't have anyway. Now, since those are more like the reasons that it's not InDesign rather than the reason it is Photoshop, let's take a second and look at a few examples of when you should use Photoshop for your layout. This is an old tutorial that I designed for my students back when I taught Photoshop, and it's pure Photoshop through and through. It's not a type-heavy design, and more importantly, the type interacts heavily with the graphic elements. This isn't a distressed font at all, it's just plain old impact, so all of the wood texture on it is from Photoshop. Also, the slight bit of transparency in the wing over the A is much more practical to create in Photoshop, and even if I technically could do it in Illustrator or InDesign, there's really no reason to do it, and it would really only slow me down and lower the quality of the finished product. This is a tutorial from an old lesson on clipping groups, and while in some ways it is very text-heavy, none of the text is heavily modified, which would be easier in Illustrator, and nothing here would benefit from paragraph styles, master pages, or anything else that plays to InDesign's strengths. More importantly, the masking involved on this one is a single click, and all of my text stays completely editable. So when would I use Photoshop? When I have a very graphics-heavy layout with minimal text, when the text interacts significantly with graphic elements on the page, more than just changing a blending mode or so, and when it's a single-page layout. On to Illustrator. Right off the bat, with almost 100% of the assets being vector already, Photoshop is out. I mean, it would still work, but why bother? Now, if you're in a pinch, or a competition, and the answer is because I know how to do this in Photoshop but not anything else, then that's your answer. Otherwise, Illustrator. There are modifications that need to be made to several of the graphics, masking work that's a lot easier in Illustrator, and there's not much in the way of continuous text or anything that would benefit from paragraph styles. The text wrap around the sword graphic would be easier in InDesign, but with so much of the rest working better in Illustrator, I saw no reason to switch programs. That being said, there's no problem at all with doing 80% of this in Illustrator and then finishing the more text-heavy areas in InDesign. This was ultimately an Illustrator piece because there were a large number of vector graphics that needed to be modified in some way, it was a single-page layout, and the ability to flow text and utilize text styles wouldn't have been a big advantage. That leaves us with our InDesign project. Here we have a project that's very structured, isn't multi-page but has multiple panels that all need to have their own margins, lots of placed graphics that don't really interact graphically with the text, and most importantly, lots and lots of regularly styled text. This is text that clearly flows between multiple columns, has consistently styled headers, body copy, and bullets, and enough of them to make text styles an absolute necessity. Now, there are probably other reasons as well, but honestly, the amount of copy alone would send me running straight to InDesign without a second thought. Another thing that absolutely screams InDesign is more detailed text wraps, like we see around the B in this national contest from 2017. This can be faked in Photoshop and Illustrator, but it's a real pain in the backside. Lastly, I don't want to leave out the unsung hero that is Bridge. While it's probably a touch handier in a multi-monitor setup, it is still absolutely invaluable. It lets you quickly see what you're working with and has the ability to preview most any file type, including audio and video files. And if you take the time to do it, which is totally worthwhile in the long run, you can add ratings and other metadata like keywords that make finding resources much easier as your collection grows. In closing, I want to say a few things that I feel are particularly important. 1. In crunch time, we will always gravitate towards the program we're best at. That's fine, and probably the best plan when the clock is ticking. But you need to become pretty darn proficient in at least Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign before you hit the workforce, and that's a lot sooner than it might seem like right now. And 2, we've been talking about the best program to use for whatever. But the truth is that most projects involve at least 2 different programs, if not 3 or more. Trying to do everything in one program all the time is shooting yourself in the foot before you ever get started. Keep pushing yourself in the programs you're already good in, practice hard in the programs you're not, and practice twice as hard in the programs you suck in. And I think that sums it up pretty nicely. I hope this helps you out, and that you'll stay tuned for the next installment. Thanks.